Aristotle is remembered as the father of logic, the teacher of Alexander the Great, and the mind that shaped Western thought for more than 2,000 years. But here is a mystery history rarely asks. How did the greatest philosopher of reason come to flee like a criminal from the very city that once revered his intellect? Imagine the city of Athens holding its breath, its marble temples glowing softly in the late light, while one aging philosopher measures his steps as if each one might be his last. Visualize Aristotle not as the serene marble bust history prefers, but as a man at the peak of his intellectual power and at the edge of personal danger, walking beneath the shadow of Macedonian rule, fully aware that ideas can make enemies faster than armies. This is not the beginning of a peaceful retirement, but a moment of crisis, a narrowing corridor where thought, politics, and survival collide. The central question rises immediately, quietly but insistently, like a pulse beneath the stone streets. How did a man who devoted his life to reason, classification, and balance come to stand accused by the very city that once defined philosophy itself? How does a thinker who sought order in all things become trapped inside the disorder of history, forced to choose between martyrdom and escape? And more unsettling still, what kind of legacy is forged when wisdom must bend to power in order to survive? There is another question threading itself through the air of this moment, one that does not demand an answer yet, but insists on being remembered. Was Aristotle great because he pursued truth without fear, or because he understood when truth must step aside so life itself could continue? He would later be judged not only by what he taught, but by what he refused to die for. And that judgment would echo for centuries. Whether you're still tossing and turning in bed, driving down the highway, or simply looking for a wallpaper to work with, grab your phone with 35% battery and join me for today's story. If I guess correctly, leave a like. If wrong, comment your current battery percentage. Athens at this time is no longer the confident teacher of the Greek world. It is a city bruised by defeat, haunted by memories of lost wars, and suffocating beneath the political dominance of Macedon. The old pride still clings to its theaters and academies, but beneath that pride is fear, and beneath that fear is resentment. Philosophers are no longer harmless observers. They are symbols. They are reminders of past greatness. They are, when convenient, scapegoats. Aristotle knows this atmosphere intimately. He has lived long enough to understand how quickly admiration curdles into suspicion. He has watched alliances shift, watched patrons fall, watched students grow into kings and conquerors whose decisions reshape the map of the world. He understands power, not as an abstract idea, but as a force that presses on the chest, that limits breadth, that dictates which questions are safe to ask and which ones invite destruction. This moment of danger is not sudden. It is the final tightening of a knot that has been forming for decades. Aristotle is Macedonian by association, bound by blood, loyalty, and history to a kingdom that Athens both needs and despises. He once tutored a boy named Alexander, a boy who would become something far larger and far more terrifying than any teacher could control. That connection alone is enough to make him suspect. Combined with his influence, his school, and his intellectual authority, it makes him dangerous. Yet what makes this moment truly paradoxical is that Aristotle has spent his entire life arguing against excess. He believed in moderation, in balance, in the mean between extremes. He analyzed tyranny, warned against mob emotion, dissected the failures of democracy and oligarchy alike. He did not preach rebellion. He did not rally crowds. He built systems, definitions, categories. He believed knowledge advanced not through shouting, but through patient accumulation. And still, here he stands, accused of impiety. The same charge once leveled against Socrates. The irony is not lost on him. He knows the script. He knows how Athens treats philosophers when politics demand a sacrifice. He knows how easily a trial becomes theater, how quickly reason is drowned by resentment, how memory rewrites itself once a body is buried. The city remembers Socrates as a moral hero now, but Aristotle remembers him as a warning. He remembers that Athens did not regret its actions until it was safe to do so. He remembers that truth does not protect the body, only the idea. And he is forced to confront a decision that cuts to the heart of his philosophy. Is it more virtuous to die for principle, or to live so that principle can endure? This is where Aristotle's character reveals itself most clearly. Not in a lecture hall, not in a manuscript, but in hesitation. He is not driven by the hunger for martyrdom. He does not confuse drama with virtue. He has spent a lifetime studying causes, consequences, and purposes, and he understands that death would end his ability to teach, to revise, to clarify. A dead philosopher becomes a symbol. A living one remains a mind at work. To understand why this choice matters, one must understand what Aristotle represents at this moment. He is not merely a thinker among thinkers. He is a system builder, a man attempting something no one before him had fully dared. He seeks to map reality itself, to understand how things move, change, grow, and decay. He studies animals not as curiosities, but as evidence. He studies politics not as ideology, but as behavior. He studies ethics not as commandments, but as habits shaped over time. In a world addicted to ideals, he insists on facts. In a culture seduced by myth, he insists on method. In an age that glorifies extremes, he insists on balance. That insistence is both his strength and his vulnerability. It makes him indispensable to civilization and intolerable to those who crave simple answers. As he walks through Athens in this opening moment, Aristotle carries all of this within him: the weight of knowledge, the burden of association, the clarity of foresight. He knows that the choice he makes now will ripple outward, shaping not only his own fate, but the survival of a way of thinking that prioritizes understanding over spectacle. This story, then, is not simply about a philosopher fleeing a city. It is about the cost of thinking clearly in a world that prefers certainty. It is about how greatness is formed not only through bold action, but through restraint. And it is about the danger surrounding Aristotle at this moment forces us to look backward as much as forward. To understand how he arrived here, we must return to a much quieter place, far from Athenian courts and political fury, to a small city on the edge of the Greek world, where observation came before theory, and life taught its lessons long before Philos, long before Athens learned to fear his influence, before kings and cities shaped his fate. Aristotle's story begins on the far edge of the Greek world, in the coastal town of Stagira. This is not a place of grand temples or endless debate, but a practical settlement facing the sea. shaped by trade, weather, and survival. The air smells of salt and earth. The rhythms of life are governed not by rhetoric, but by seasons, illness, and labor. It is here, in this quieter world, that the foundations of Aristotle's mind are first laid. He is born into a household where observation is not optional. His father, Nicomachus, serves as a physician to the Macedonian court, a man trained to read the body as a system, to notice symptoms, patterns, and causes. In this environment, the young Aristotle absorbs a way of seeing before he ever learns how to argue. Disease is not punishment from the gods. Healing is not magic. The body is a structure, fragile yet intelligible, governed by rules that can be studied, tested, and refined. Long before he writes about causes and purposes, he watches them play out in flesh and blood. This early exposure matters more than it first appears. While other children grow up memorizing poems of heroes and gods, Aristotle grows up surrounded by instruments, remedies, and quiet conversations about what works and what fails. He learns that knowledge advances through attention, not through myth. He learns that truth is often subtle, that errors are corrected slowly, and that confidence without evidence can be fatal. These lessons will later resurface in his philosophy, not as memories, but as instincts. Yet, this childhood is not secure. Stability does not last. Both of Aristotle's parents die while he is still young, leaving him orphaned in a world that suddenly feels unpredictable. The household of learning becomes a household of absence. The routines that once offered clarity are replaced by uncertainty. And with that uncertainty comes a deep, unspoken need for order. Loss does not make him sentimental. It makes him systematic. Where others might retreat into faith or fantasy, Aristotle turns inward, searching for patterns that can make sense of impermanence. This is the first quiet paradox of his life. He grows up surrounded by care and science, then stripped of both. He experiences structure, then collapse, and from that tension emerges a question that will haunt his work forever. Is there a way to understand the world so clearly that loss itself becomes intelligible, not painless, not justified, but at least comprehensible? Stegera also places Aristotle at the intersection of cultures. Though Greek in language and education, it lies under Macedonian influence, a political reality that will later define his reputation. He learns early that identity is complicated, that allegiance is not always chosen, and that being associated with power can be both a privilege and a liability. This duality seeps into his thinking. He does not view politics as pure ideals battling in the abstract. He views them as lived arrangements shaped by geography, history, and necessity. As a boy, he observes nature not as decoration, but as a teacher. The coastline, the animals, the changing seasons all offer lessons without speeches. Fish behave differently than birds. Plants respond to soil and sun. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything belongs to a system. These observations, simple and unrecorded, will later become the backbone of his biological work. The reason he insists that knowledge must begin with what is seen before it ascends toward what is imagined. By the time Aristotle reaches adolescence, it is clear that Stagira can no longer contain him. His intellect strains against the limits of his environment. The questions forming in his mind require a larger stage, a city where debate is a profession and ideas are currency. Athens calls to him not as a dream, but as a necessity. It is the place where minds are tested, refined, and broken. It is also the place where a young orphan might finally find intellectual belonging. Yet, even as he prepares to leave, Stagira never truly releases him. The habits he formed here will remain embedded in his thinking. He will always trust observation before speculation. He will always suspect elegant theories that float too far from lived reality. And he will always carry within him the quiet awareness that systems fail, bodies die, and certainty is fragile. This is why Aristotle will later feel both at home and out of place in Athens. He arrives not as a dreamer intoxicated by ideas, but as a disciplined observer shaped by loss. His mind has already learned to balance wonder with restraint, curiosity with caution, and as he steps toward the city that will define him, he does so carrying the invisible weight of early grief, early training, and early insight, all converging toward a destiny that has not yet revealed its cost. By the time Aristotle leaves Stagira, he is no longer simply a gifted youth searching for opportunity. He is a young man shaped by absence, sharpened by observation, and quietly driven by a need to impose order on a world that has already taught him how quickly structure can collapse. Orphaned early, he carries with him a sense that stability must be built, not assumed, and that understanding is the only defense against chaos. Athens does not receive him gently. The city is brilliant, crowded, and relentlessly competitive. Ideas clash in its streets as loudly as merchants argue in its markets. Reputation is currency, wit is weaponry, and arrogance often masquerades as wisdom. For a young outsider, especially one with Macedonian ties, there is no safety in anonymity. Every accent is noticed, every opinion is weighed, every silence is interpreted. Yet, it is precisely this pressure that Aristotle requires. He does not seek comfort, he seeks friction. He enters the academy of Plato not as a disciple in awe, but as a mind eager to be tested. The academy itself is less a school than a living organism, a place where mathematics, metaphysics, ethics, and politics are debated with an intensity that borders on obsession. For someone like Aristotle, whose childhood trained him to observe systems, this environment is intoxicating. Still, belonging does not come easily. Plato's academy is dominated by abstraction. Forms, ideals, and perfect structures reign supreme. Reality in this worldview is a shadow of something purer, higher, and eternal. Aristotle listens carefully, studies diligently, and absorbs everything. But beneath his respect is a growing unease. He cannot ignore the tension between what is taught and what is seen. He cannot reconcile the living complexity of nature with the clean geometry of ideal forms. This internal conflict does not erupt into rebellion. It matures into discipline. Aristotle becomes one of Plato's most devoted students, staying at the academy for nearly 2 decades. He writes, teaches, debates, and refines his thinking with relentless patience. He learns to argue not through passion, but through structure. He learns how to dismantle an idea without destroying the person who holds it. And he learns something even more dangerous. He learns how to disagree with a master while appearing loyal. The absence of his parents resurfaces in this period in subtle ways. Plato becomes, in many respects, a substitute father figure, a towering presence whose approval carries enormous weight. Aristotle admires him deeply, yet resists being absorbed completely. This tension, personal as much as philosophical, drives his growth. He is not content to inherit ideas. He wants to test them, modify them, and sometimes reject them. This is where Aristotle's hunger for order deepens into method. He begins to ask not only what is true, but how we come to know what is true. He dissects arguments, categorizes types of knowledge, and distinguishes between what can be proven mathematically and what must be understood through experience. He is already moving toward the intellectual architecture that will later define his legacy, though he does not yet know its scale. Athens, meanwhile, teaches him another lesson. It teaches him that intellect alone does not guarantee security. Political moods shift, alliances form and dissolve, philosophers rise and fall, based not only on their ideas, but on their usefulness to power. As a Macedonian associated thinker in an Athenian institution, Aristotle learns to speak carefully, to observe the currents beneath public debate. This political awareness does not corrupt his thinking, it grounds it. The young man who arrived hungry for belonging becomes a thinker comfortable with tension. He learns to exist between worlds, between idealism and empiricism, between reverence and critique. This ability to inhabit contradiction will become one of his defining traits. He does not seek purity. He seeks balance. He does not pursue certainty at all costs. He pursues understanding that can endure. Aristotle is no longer merely Plato's student. He is becoming something more unsettling. A thinker capable of challenging the very foundations of the school that shaped him. Yet for now, that challenge remains controlled, respectful, and incomplete. The real break has not yet come. It waits quietly in the future, tied to death, exile, and the realization that loyalty to truth sometimes requires walking away from the place you once called home. When Aristotle arrives fully into the orbit of Plato's academy, he steps into a world that believes it already knows what truth looks like. The grounds are shaded and serene, yet the ideas cultivated there are sharp, demanding, and uncompromising. Plato's presence dominates everything. His voice defines the terms of debate. His theory of forms offers an intoxicating promise that beyond the mess of daily life exists a realm of perfect, unchanging realities, and that philosophy's task is to remember, not to discover. For Aristotle, this vision is both irresistible and troubling. He does not dismiss it. He studies it with care, respect, and intensity. He learns the language of abstraction, the elegance of deductive reasoning, and the power of unified explanation. He comes to understand why Plato's ideas inspire loyalty bordering on devotion. In a chaotic world, the promise of eternal forms offers refuge, certainty, and moral clarity. Yet something in Aristotle resists surrender. The habits formed in Stagira, the physician's son trained to watch bodies and symptoms, cannot be silenced. He listens to discussions of perfect horses, perfect justice, perfect triangles, and his mind quietly asks a different question. Where exactly do these perfections live? Not in the stable, not in the courtroom, not in the dust of the road. They exist somewhere beyond experience, and that distance unsettles him. This tension sharpens as Aristotle begins teaching within the academy itself. He is no longer only a student absorbing wisdom. He is now a voice contributing to it. His lectures reveal a different instinct. Where Plato ascends toward universals, Aristotle lingers among particulars. Where Plato seeks what never changes, Aristotle studies what grows, adapts, and decays. He is not rejecting his teacher. He is reframing the problem. He starts asking questions that feel almost impolite in their practicality. How do we know something exists apart from its examples? How can a form explain motion if it never moves? How can ethics be derived from ideals if human character is shaped by habit, environment, and choice? These questions do not explode into open conflict. They circulate quietly, unsettling those who prefer philosophical purity over intellectual discomfort. Plato notices, of course. He recognizes Aristotle's brilliance, even as he senses its divergence. There is admiration here, but also distance. Aristotle is brilliant not because he repeats doctrine, but because he refines it, challenges it, and stretches it beyond its original shape. He is great not because he accepts the Academy's answers, but because he insists on understanding how those answers connect to the world people actually inhabit. This period marks a crucial transformation. Aristotle learns how powerful ideas can become insulated from reality. He learns how schools preserve themselves by defending assumptions rather than testing them. And he learns, painfully, that disagreement within a system is tolerated only up to a point. Beyond that point, loyalty becomes suspect. Still, he remains. He stays because the Academy offers what no other place can. It offers time, dialogue, and intellectual pressure. For nearly 20 years, Aristotle sharpens himself here, absorbing the strengths of Platonic thought while quietly preparing to move beyond it. He learns how to build arguments with precision. He learns how to anticipate objections. And he learns how to disagree without burning bridges, at least for now. The paradox deepens. Aristotle owes his formation to Plato, yet his future will require departing from Plato's central vision. He stands at the edge of something new, though he does not yet see its full shape. The break will not come through rebellion or insult. It will come through necessity, loss, and the realization that truth, like life, does not exist in a separate realm untouched by change. For the moment, however, Aristotle remains within the Academy's walls, walking its paths, listening to its debates, and quietly gathering the tools he will one day use to construct a philosophy grounded not in perfection, but in reality itself. Aristotle's years inside Plato's Academy do not unfold as a simple apprenticeship. They evolve into something far more delicate and far more difficult. He is, at the same time, a devoted student, a careful critic, and a quiet opponent. He learns deeply from Plato, absorbs the architecture of his thought, and respects the ambition behind it. Yet he resists something fundamental at its core, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. Plato teaches that reality is anchored in certainty, that behind the shifting world of appearances lies a realm of unchanging forms, perfect, eternal, and more real than the things human beings touch and see. Justice itself exists beyond courts. Beauty itself exists beyond faces. Knowledge, in this view, is recollection rather than discovery. To understand is to remember what the soul already knows. Aristotle listens. He studies. He masters this framework so thoroughly that he can speak it fluently, defend it convincingly, and teach it competently. He does not reject Plato out of ignorance. He rejects him out of intimacy. This is the crucial distinction. Aristotle's resistance grows precisely because he understands the system so well. What troubles him is not the beauty of abstraction, but its confidence. The forms explain everything too cleanly. They flatten the messy richness of lived experience into ideal shapes that never change. Aristotle, trained from childhood to watch bodies heal and fail, animals adapt and perish, societies rise and decay, cannot ignore the evidence before his eyes. Reality, as he encounters it, is not static. It is dynamic, layered, and contingent. Here, his opposition takes shape, quietly. He begins asking questions that destabilize certainty without attacking it directly. If the form of a thing exists separately, how does it cause change in the thing itself? If ethics is grounded in perfect ideals, how does it account for flawed human behavior? If knowledge is eternal, why does understanding grow through experience, error, and correction? These questions do not seek to destroy Plato's system. They seek to expose its limits. Aristotle is great not because he dismisses abstraction, but because he refuses to let it rule unchallenged. He believes philosophy must begin where life begins, in what exists, not in what is imagined to exist beyond it. This resistance is disciplined. Aristotle does not stage confrontations. He does not proclaim a new doctrine. He allows the tension to remain unresolved, trusting that truth emerges through sustained pressure rather than sudden rupture. This patience defines him. He is not revolutionary by temperament. He is evolutionary. Ideas, like organisms, must adapt to survive. The relationship between student and teacher becomes increasingly complex. Plato recognizes Aristotle's brilliance and likely senses the divergence forming beneath it. There is respect, but also distance. Aristotle is no longer merely receiving wisdom. He is testing it, and testing within any intellectual hierarchy is dangerous. Yet, Aristotle remains loyal. He stays at the academy. He teaches within its walls. He credits Plato openly and sincerely. Later, he will famously acknowledge this bond with a sentence that reveals everything about his character. He will say that he loves Plato, but he loves truth more. That love for truth does not express itself as arrogance. It expresses itself as refusal to accept certainty without examination. This period shapes Aristotle's mature voice. He learns how to argue without hostility, how to critique without contempt, and how to separate respect for a person from obedience to their ideas. These skills will become essential when he later confronts kings, cities, and traditions far more powerful than any school. By the end of these years, Aristotle has become something rare. A thinker formed by a great system who is not imprisoned by it. A student who honors his teacher by refusing to imitate him. A philosopher who understands that abstraction is useful, but only when anchored to the world it claims to explain. The quiet resistance cultivated here will soon demand a higher price. Certainty resents its challengers, even gentle ones. And when protection disappears, when authority changes hands, Aristotle will learn that devotion does not guarantee belonging, and that philosophical integrity often reveals itself only when comfort is withdrawn. As Aristotle's thinking matures, the tension between forms and facts no longer remains a quiet undercurrent. It becomes the central fault line of his philosophy. He does not abandon Plato's world of ideals outright. Instead, he begins repositioning it, lowering it from the heavens, and forcing it to answer to the ground beneath human feet. This shift is subtle, deliberate, and irreversible. Plato taught that the highest truths exist apart from the material world. Aristotle begins to suspect the opposite, that truth reveals itself through the material world, patiently and imperfectly, to those willing to observe it closely. He starts favoring what is real over what is ideal, not because ideals are useless, but because they explain too little on their own. A perfect circle may exist in thought, but no one lives inside a circle. Human beings live among imperfect lines, unfinished actions, and changing circumstances. This is where Aristotle's philosophical courage emerges. He challenges certainty, not with rebellion, but with replacement. Instead of asking what a thing ought to be in its perfect form, he asks what it is, how it comes to be, and what purpose it serves within a larger system. Knowledge, in his view, is not recollection of eternal truths. It is the result of careful attention to how things behave over time. He begins developing a new language of explanation, one grounded in causes rather than ideals. Not one cause, but several. What something is made of, what shape or structure it takes, what brings it into motion, and most importantly, what it is for. This layered way of understanding reality allows Aristotle to explain change without escaping into abstraction. Things move because they have purposes. They grow because they are directed toward ends inherent within them. This approach transforms philosophy from contemplation into investigation. Aristotle studies plants not to glimpse perfection, but to understand growth. He studies animals not as symbols, but as systems. He studies politics not as an ideal constitution, but as lived arrangements shaped by geography, habit, and power. Each domain reinforces the same lesson. Reality resists simplification. It demands patience, classification, and humility. The divergence from Plato now becomes unmistakable. Where Plato looks upward, Aristotle looks outward. Where Plato seeks escape from the material world, Aristotle seeks mastery of it through understanding. This does not make Aristotle anti-ideal. It makes him anti-illusion. He refuses to treat ideas as more real than the lives they claim to explain. Ethics undergoes a similar transformation. Aristotle rejects the notion that virtue can be reduced to knowledge of the good alone. Knowing what is right does not guarantee doing what is right. Character is not a theorem. It is a habit formed through repeated action. People become just by acting justly, courageous by acting courageously, moderate by practicing restraint. Virtue lives in practice, not in abstraction. This insistence on habit, context, and gradual formation places Aristotle at odds with philosophical purists. It also makes his work dangerously relevant. He is no longer describing a moral ideal few can reach. He is describing a moral process anyone can fail at. Ethics becomes demanding not because it is lofty, but because it is continuous. The same realism shapes his view of knowledge itself. Aristotle begins distinguishing between kinds of truth. Some truths are necessary and unchanging. Others are probable, flexible, and dependent on circumstance. To confuse these categories is to invite error. This distinction becomes foundational to logic, science, and politics. It allows Aristotle to say something radical without sounding radical at all. Not all questions deserve the same kind of answer. This intellectual shift does not occur in isolation. It reflects Aristotle's lived experience. He has watched institutions fail. He has seen teachers die. He has observed how power reshapes truth depending on need. These experiences reinforce his suspicion of certainty. Systems that claim perfection often break first when reality intervenes. Yet, Aristotle does not present himself as a destroyer of Plato's legacy. He positions himself as its continuer, its corrector, its grounding force. He believes philosophy must serve life, not hover above it. And life, as he understands it, is defined by motion, contradiction, and unfinished purpose. By favoring the real over the ideal, Aristotle commits himself to a harder path. He forfeits the comfort of absolutes. He accepts the burden of complexity. He chooses a philosophy that can be wrong, revised, and improved. In doing so, he lays the groundwork for something entirely new, a way of thinking that will eventually shape science, ethics, and politics for centuries. This divergence is not yet a rupture, but it is no longer invisible. Aristotle is moving away from the safety of Platonic certainty toward the exposed terrain of empirical truth. And once that movement begins, there is no returning to the calm, distant realm of perfect forms. There is only the living world, demanding explanation, and the philosopher willing to meet it on its own terms. Plato's death does not arrive with thunder or ceremony. Yet, it changes everything. The academy continues to stand, its walls unchanged, its routines intact. But the presence that once held its contradictions together is gone. What remains is not a living dialogue, but a structure suddenly anxious about preservation. With Plato absent, the academy no longer tolerates ambiguity as easily. It begins to protect its inheritance. For Aristotle, this shift is immediate and unmistakable. While Plato lived, disagreement was sheltered by authority. Divergence could be interpreted as brilliance, resistance as refinement. Now, those same qualities appear threatening. The question is no longer whether Aristotle is intelligent or productive. It is whether he is safe. Succession exposes the fault lines. When leadership is decided, Aristotle is passed over. The decision is quiet, procedural, and final. No accusations are spoken aloud, yet the message is clear. He is too empirical, too willing to anchor philosophy in the material world. He respects Plato, but he does not preserve Plato's system intact. For an institution now concerned with continuity, this makes him unacceptable. This moment forces a reckoning. Aristotle confronts a truth he has long analyzed but never fully faced. Institutions value stability more than inquiry. They reward loyalty over insight. They prefer clarity, even if that clarity is artificial, over complexity that invites uncertainty. The academy does not expel him openly. It simply no longer belongs to him. Leaving is not dramatic. There is no public rupture, no final speech. Aristotle departs Athens carrying something heavier than resentment. He carries humility. For the first time since his arrival as a youth, he stands without institutional shelter. His ideas must survive on their own merit, detached from Plato's name, unprotected by the prestige of the academy. This exile is intellectual as much as geographic. Aristotle is forced to test whether his philosophy can live outside the environment that shaped it. He must confront the possibility that he is wrong, that his resistance to abstraction has isolated him unnecessarily, that he has sacrificed belonging for an idea not yet fully formed. This doubt is not weakness, it is discipline. It tempers his confidence and sharpens his focus. The departure also reveals Aristotle's character. He does not linger in bitterness. He does not attempt to undermine the academy from outside. He leaves quietly, decisively, accepting the cost of independence. This restraint reflects his deepest conviction. Philosophy exists to understand reality, not to win positions. If understanding requires exile, then exile becomes part of the method. As he steps away from Athens, Aristotle enters a period of wandering that will redefine his work. Freed from doctrinal expectations, he begins observing the world more directly. Nature, politics, and human behavior become his texts. He studies without needing to prove loyalty to a school. He asks questions without needing to preserve a tradition. This transition marks a low point in terms of security and status, but a turning point in intellectual freedom. Aristotle is no longer a student, nor a rival within the academy. He becomes something rarer and more dangerous, a thinker without an institution, guided only by method, evidence, and purpose. The academy's doors may close behind him, but what opens instead is a broader world, one that will challenge him to refine his ideas against reality itself. Exile strips away certainty. It also creates space, and in that exile does not cast Aristotle into silence. It releases him into motion. Leaving Athens, he moves eastward into Asia Minor, a region of ports, kingdoms, and biological richness that could not be more different from the enclosed debates of the academy. The philosopher, who once walked shaded paths among abstract arguments, now walks coastlines, marketplaces, and courts. The world itself becomes his classroom. This wandering is not aimless. Aristotle travels with intention, carrying with him a discipline sharpened by loss and humility. No longer protected by institutional authority, he relies on observation, comparison, and patient accumulation of detail. He studies cities not as ideals, but as organisms. He watches how laws shape behavior, how geography influences politics, how customs emerge from necessity rather than theory. Each place teaches him something Athens never could. In Assos and later in Mytilene, Aristotle encounters environments rich in natural diversity. Here, plants and animals are not theoretical examples. They are living systems, interacting, adapting, and struggling for survival. Aristotle observes marine life closely, noting differences in reproduction, movement, and structure. He dissects, records, and classifies, not to dominate nature, but to understand it on its own terms. This period marks a decisive expansion of his method. Observation becomes systematic. Patterns are not assumed, they are earned. Aristotle begins cataloging similarities and differences, grouping organisms by shared characteristics. He notices that form and function are inseparable. An animal's structure reveals its way of life. Purpose is embedded within design, not imposed from outside. These insights will later revolutionize biology, but here they emerge quietly, born of patience rather than proclamation. Politics, too, comes into sharper focus. Asia Minor is a mosaic of governance, from city-states to monarchies, each shaped by history and necessity. Aristotle studies how power operates in practice, He watches rulers negotiate loyalty, balance factions, and manage dissent. He observes how laws succeed or fail depending on culture and circumstance. These experiences reinforce his conviction that political theory, divorced from reality, is not wisdom, but fantasy. During these years, Aristotle is no longer reacting against Plato. He is building something of his own. His philosophy grows outward rather than upward. Instead of searching for perfect models, he identifies ranges, tendencies, and probabilities. He learns that most human affairs do not allow certainty. They demand judgment, flexibility, and practical wisdom. This realization will later crystallize into his concept of prudence, the ability to act well in situations where rules alone are insufficient. There is also a personal transformation underway. Wandering strips Aristotle of prestige, but it also grants him clarity. Without the pressure to defend a school or appease rivals, he becomes more precise, more patient, more grounded. He is learning not just what to think, but how to live as a philosopher outside protective walls. This independence deepens his respect for reality's complexity and his suspicion of easy answers. Aristotle's attention turns increasingly towards systems, living arrangements of parts, working together toward ends. A city functions like an organism. A household mirrors larger political structures. An animal's organs cooperate toward survival. Nothing meaningful exists in isolation. This systems thinking becomes one of his greatest contributions. It allows him to see continuity between nature and society, biology and ethics, observation and meaning. These years also teach him restraint. He resists the temptation to rush conclusions. He records anomalies. He acknowledges uncertainty. He accepts that some questions require time, repetition, and comparison across regions and cultures. This humility is not passive. It is disciplined. It reflects a thinker who understands that understanding itself is a process, not a revelation. As Aristotle moves from place to place, his philosophy matures into something resilient. It is no longer dependent on Athens or Plato. It is shaped by coastlines, climates, and political realities. It becomes adaptable, capable of explaining difference without collapsing into relativism. He learns to hold variation within structure, diversity within order. By the end of this wandering period, Aristotle has transformed exile into apprenticeship under the world itself. Nature has become his text, cities his experiments, living systems his proofs. What began as displacement has become preparation. The philosopher who will later teach kings and found institutions is being forged here, not through authority, but through attention. And as his understanding deepens, fate begins to draw him toward a role that will test whether philosophy can do more than explain the world. It will test whether it can shape power itself. During these years away from Athens, as Aristotle's philosophy grows broader and more grounded, his life also narrows in a different and necessary way. Wandering gives him perspective, but intimacy gives him weight. It is in this quieter phase, far from the theaters of intellectual rivalry, that Aristotle forms the bonds that tether his thinking to mortality itself. He marries Pythias, a woman of intelligence and social standing, closely connected to the political networks of Asia Minor. Their union is not merely strategic, though it exists within a web of alliances. It is stabilizing, For a man whose life has been shaped by early loss and long intellectual isolation, domestic life introduces something philosophy alone cannot provide: responsibility for another life, attention to daily rhythms, the fragile continuity of family. Marriage alters Aristotle's relationship to abstraction. Theories about ethics and virtue now unfold alongside the reality of care, compromise, and vulnerability. Love resists classification. It demands patience rather than proof. In this domestic setting, Aristotle experiences the limits of reason as a governing force. Knowledge can guide action, but it cannot replace affection. Understanding does not eliminate fragility. It only makes fragility visible. Their household becomes a living laboratory for ideas Aristotle has been forming quietly. He observes how character is shaped not by isolated decisions, but by repeated habits within relationships, how patience, generosity, and restraint are learned through practice, not instruction. The household, he begins to see, is the smallest political unit, where power, duty, and affection intersect daily. Tragedy also enters this space. Pythias dies while Aristotle is still relatively young. Her death reopens wounds he has carried since childhood. Loss returns, not as abstraction, but as interruption. Domestic order collapses again, reminding him that no system, however carefully constructed, can insulate life from suffering. This experience deepens his ethics. He does not respond to grief by retreating into idealism. He responds by refining his understanding of virtue as something lived under pressure. Courage, he realizes, is not the absence of pain, but the endurance of it without surrendering one's commitments. Moderation is not detachment, but balance maintained even when emotion threatens to overwhelm. Later, Aristotle forms another partnership with Hyppilas, and together they raise a son, Nicomachus. Fatherhood introduces a new dimension to his thinking. Teaching is no longer confined to students or audiences. It becomes intimate, long-term, and unrecorded. A child does not respond to arguments. A child responds to example, consistency, and care. This reinforces Aristotle's conviction that moral education is embodied before it is articulated. Naming his son after his own father closes a quiet circle. The physician's legacy, interrupted by early death, finds continuity through teaching rather than medicine. Aristotle's life, once marked by orphanhood, now contains lineage. This continuity does not erase loss. It contextualizes it. It transforms grief into responsibility. Family life anchors Aristotle's philosophy in mortality. It reminds him that human beings are finite, dependent, and shaped by bonds they do not choose. Ethics, in this light, cannot be a system of ideals alone. It must account for love, loss, and obligation. It must speak to people who age, suffer, and die. These experiences soften Aristotle's voice without weakening it. His philosophy becomes more humane, less absolute. He does not abandon rigor. He enriches it with compassion. The world he seeks to understand is no longer populated only by concepts and systems, but by individuals whose lives intersect briefly and meaningfully. As Aristotle continues his journey, carrying the weight of family and memory, his thinking becomes increasingly suited to the real conditions of human life. Philosophy, for him, is no longer an escape from mortality. It is a way of living responsibly within it, and that understanding prepares him for the most consequential role of his life, one that will bind his fate to power itself. When Aristotle is summoned to Macedonia, the invitation carries both honor and unease. He is asked to tutor a prince named Alexander, the son of King Philip II, a boy already surrounded by ambition, expectation, and violence. This is no ordinary student. This is power in its formative state. For Aristotle, the question is immediate and unsettling. Can philosophy guide a future conqueror, or will it merely decorate ambition with better language? Alexander is young, brilliant, and restless. He absorbs ideas quickly, but he also radiates intensity. His mind leaps ahead of instruction, impatient with limits. Aristotle recognizes the danger immediately. Intelligence without restraint magnifies desire. Knowledge without character sharpens cruelty. Teaching Alexander will not be about filling a mind. It will be about shaping judgment. Aristotle approaches this task with method rather than illusion. He does not attempt to turn Alexander into a philosopher king in the Platonic sense. He understands the futility of imposing ideals on temperament. Instead, he teaches selectively. Ethics grounded in habit. Politics grounded in reality. Literature that reveals character through consequence. Homer becomes a guide not for glory alone, but for cost. Achilles is not only heroic, he is wrathful, destructive, and tragic. This educational relationship tests Aristotle's deepest convictions. He believes virtue is formed through practice, not instruction alone. Yet here he stands, responsible for shaping the moral framework of someone who will command armies. The imbalance is stark. Philosophy moves slowly, power moves quickly. Aristotle can offer structure, warning, and perspective, but he cannot control how they will be used. Still, he teaches with care. He emphasizes moderation, self-mastery, and the responsibilities of rule. He insists that leadership is not domination, but stewardship. A ruler must understand human nature, not flatter it. Laws exist to cultivate virtue, not merely to enforce order. These lessons are seeds, not guarantees. Alexander listens. He admires Aristotle deeply. He carries books into battle. He asks questions about the natural world, about culture, about destiny. For a time, it seems possible that philosophy might temper conquest. But Aristotle is not naive. He observes the limits of his influence. Alexander's ambition is elemental, driven by forces no teacher can fully redirect. This realization forces Aristotle into painful honesty. Philosophy cannot replace character. It can only clarify it. It can sharpen judgment, but it cannot erase desire. Teaching Alexander reveals both the power and the fragility of ideas when exposed to authority. Wisdom can advise power. It cannot command it. As Alexander grows and eventually departs to fulfill his destiny, the relationship transforms. Respect remains, but distance grows. The student becomes a king. The tutor becomes a memory. Aristotle watches from afar as Alexander's campaigns reshape the world, spreading Greek culture even as they unleash destruction. The experiment has begun, and its outcome is ambiguous. This chapter of Aristotle's life leaves him with no illusions about power. He has seen its potential to elevate and to devastate. He has learned that philosophy's role is not to control history, but to illuminate its consequences. Teaching Alexander does not make Aristotle responsible for conquest, but it makes him acutely aware of the stakes when ideas meet ambition. The experience sharpens his political thought. It reinforces his belief that good governance depends less on brilliance than on character, less on vision than on restraint, and it leaves him with a lingering question that will haunt his later work. If philosophy cannot rule power, can it at least survive alongside it? As Alexander's star rises, Aristotle allows himself a cautious hope. It is not the naive dream of a philosopher intoxicated by proximity to power, but a disciplined, conditional optimism. For the first time in his life, the world's greatest political force is being shaped, however imperfectly, by someone trained in reason, ethics, and observation. The question that has followed him since Athens now presses forward with new urgency. Can reason shape empire without being consumed by it? Aristotle imagines an empire guided not merely by force, but by order. Not a chaos of conquest, but a structure capable of sustaining culture, learning, and law across vast distances. He does not envision universal equality. His worldview remains hierarchical, grounded in his time. But within that hierarchy, he imagines proportion, education, and purpose. Power in this vision is not self-justifying. It is a tool whose legitimacy depends on the flourishing it enables. Alexander's campaigns initially seem to support this hope. Cities are founded, Greek language and learning spread, roads and institutions follow armies. Aristotle watches as Hellenic culture extends beyond its birthplace, reaching regions that had never encountered its literature or philosophy. To him, this looks like the expansion of rational order into a fragmented world. Yet even as he entertains this vision, Aristotle remains uneasy. He understands the seduction of scale. The larger a system becomes, the easier it is to lose sight of individual lives. He knows that conquest, even when guided by ideals, leaves scars. Reason can organize empire. It cannot purify violence. This tension shapes his political theory. Aristotle begins thinking more deeply about citizenship, belonging, and the limits of governance. A city, he argues, exists not merely to survive, but to enable a good life. An empire, by contrast, risks becoming too vast to cultivate virtue effectively. Laws can extend across territories. Character cannot. Still, he does not abandon the dream entirely. He imagines a synthesis, an empire that preserves local customs while sharing universal principles of reason. Education becomes central to this vision, not education for obedience, but education for judgment. He believes that if rulers are trained to understand human nature, law, and purpose, they may resist tyranny even when tempted by it. Aristotle's optimism here is careful, almost fragile. He knows history offers few examples of power restrained by wisdom. Yet he also knows that ideas must be tested, not dismissed. Alexander's empire becomes the proving ground for this experiment. If it succeeds, philosophy gains relevance beyond schools. If it fails, philosophy must confront its own limitations. As reports of Alexander's campaigns grow more extreme, the tension deepens. The boundaries between liberation and domination blur. Cities welcome Greek culture, but also submit to foreign rule. Knowledge spreads, but so does fear. Aristotle begins to see that reason can justify conquest as easily as it can restrain it. This realization does not make him cynical. It makes him precise. He refines his understanding of power's relationship to virtue. Power amplifies character. It does not transform it. An enlightened empire requires enlightened rulers, and enlightenment cannot be imposed by decree or achieved through conquest alone. Aristotle's dream then evolves. It becomes less about empire and more about influence. Perhaps reason cannot rule the world directly. Perhaps its role is to shape those who shape it, imperfectly, incrementally, and at great risk. This shift marks a subtle retreat from political ambition toward philosophical realism. As Alexander marches eastward, beyond Aristotle's reach, the philosopher remains behind, watching the experiment unfold. His hope persists, but it is tempered by observation. He is learning, once again, that the world resists perfect systems, and in that resistance, he finds not despair, but clarity. When Aristotle returns to Athens, he does so as a different man than the one who left. He is no longer a student defined by a master, nor an exile defined by rejection. He returns with a body of thought tested against nature, politics, family, and power itself. What he seeks now is not acceptance, but space, a place where inquiry can proceed without devotion to abstraction or fear of authority. That place becomes the Lyceum. Unlike Plato's academy, the Lyceum is not built around a single doctrine or metaphysical vision. It is organized around a method. Aristotle designs it as a working institution, devoted to systematic knowledge, careful classification, and collaborative inquiry. The emphasis is not on revelation, but on process, not on remembering eternal truths, but on discovering patterns through observation and comparison. Teaching at the Lyceum looks different from anything Athens has seen before. Aristotle lectures while walking, turning movement itself into pedagogy. Knowledge, he suggests without saying, is not static. It unfolds. Students follow him through colonnades as ideas unfold through questions, distinctions, and examples drawn from the world they inhabit. Philosophy becomes something practiced, not merely contemplated. The Lyceum's scope is astonishing. Aristotle organizes research across disciplines no one had previously attempted to unify: biology, logic, ethics, politics, rhetoric, metaphysics, poetry. Each field is treated as distinct, yet interconnected. He insists on defining terms carefully, on separating what belongs to one domain from what belongs to another. Confusion, he believes, is the enemy of understanding. This insistence on clarity produces something revolutionary. Aristotle develops formal logic, not as a game, but as a tool for all inquiry. He establishes rules for reasoning that apply regardless of subject. Valid arguments must follow structure. Conclusions must follow premises. Thought itself becomes something that can be examined, tested, and refined. The Lyceum also functions as a research center. Aristotle and his students collect data, record observations, and compile constitutions from across the Greek world. Politics becomes empirical. Ethics becomes descriptive. Biology becomes comparative. Knowledge expands not through isolated genius, but through collective effort. This institutional design reflects Aristotle's mature understanding of philosophy's role. Truth is not owned by individuals. It emerges through sustained, shared inquiry. The Lyceum is built to outlast him, to continue questioning even after his voice falls silent. It is, in a sense, his answer to the fragility of human life. If individuals perish, systems of inquiry can endure. Yet, Athens remains uneasy. Aristotle's Macedonian associations linger. His influence is undeniable. His school attracts students, attention, and authority. The city tolerates him for now, but the tension never fully dissolves. Aristotle understands this. He has learned not to confuse permission with security. Still, these years represent a high point. Aristotle is teaching freely, writing extensively, and shaping a generation of thinkers. His dream of systematic knowledge finds form. He has built an institution not to glorify himself, but to serve inquiry. This is his victory, quiet but profound. The Lyceum stands as a testament to Aristotle's belief that understanding requires structure without rigidity, openness without chaos. It embodies his conviction that philosophy must engage the world without being consumed by it. And for a time, it seems as though this balance might hold. But history is never finished. As power shifts once more, as empires rise and fall, Aristotle will again be forced to confront the limits of institutions and the cost of thinking clearly in a world that fears complexity. With the Lyceum established, Aristotle enters the most productive phase of his life. This is the period where ambition gives way to endurance, where scattered insights harden into structure, and where the desire to understand the world becomes an almost monastic discipline. He is no longer reacting to teachers, rivals, or patrons. He is building a map of reality itself. Aristotle begins cataloging the world with a precision that borders on obsession. Animals are observed, dissected, compared. He records differences in blood, bone, reproduction, and behavior. Fish are not merely fish. They are classified by habitat, anatomy, and function. Birds are distinguished by flight, diet, and nesting. Life, he insists, must be understood from the inside outward. Form and function are inseparable. This biological work is not a distraction from philosophy. It is philosophy in its most grounded form. Aristotle believes that understanding life requires attention to detail, not reverence for mystery. He studies the ordinary with the same seriousness others reserve for the divine. In doing so, he elevates observation itself into a philosophical act. Logic advances alongside biology. Aristotle formalizes reasoning into structures that can be taught, tested, and repeated. Syllogisms become tools, not ornaments. He defines how conclusions follow from premises, how errors arise from ambiguity, and how clarity protects thought from manipulation. This work quietly reshapes intellectual history. For centuries, logic will mean Aristotle's logic. Ethics, too, finds its mature expression here. Aristotle describes virtue not as purity, but as balance. Courage lies between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lies between stinginess and excess. The good life is not defined by extremes, but by proportion. Happiness, he argues, is not pleasure alone, nor honor, nor wealth. It is activity in accordance with reason, sustained over a lifetime. Politics becomes an extension of ethics rather than its replacement. Aristotle studies constitutions not to crown the best one abstractly, but to understand why systems succeed or fail. He analyzes democracies, oligarchies, monarchies, and mixed forms. Stability, he observes, depends on inclusion, moderation, and respect for circumstance. No system endures by ideology alone. Throughout this period, Aristotle's method remains consistent. Define terms, observe patterns, compare cases, refuse false certainty. He builds knowledge the way an architect builds a city, with foundations, supports, and careful proportions. Nothing is left floating without purpose. This work demands collaboration. The Lyceum becomes a hive of activity. Students gather data, record customs, and test arguments. Aristotle encourages disagreement within structure. Inquiry thrives not through obedience, but through disciplined challenge. Truth, he believes, emerges through friction properly contained. Yet, even in this creative abundance, Aristotle remains aware of limits. Knowledge expands, but mortality remains. He writes not as someone racing against death, but as someone building something meant to outlast him. His tone grows steadier, more patient, less combative. Vocabulary softens. The urgency of youth gives way to the calm of mastery. This period fulfills the promise hinted at in his early exile. Stripped of institutional loyalty, shaped by observation, tempered by loss, Aristotle now stands at the center of a system that reflects his deepest convictions. Reality is intelligible. Human life is complex. Understanding requires humility, but history does not reward even the most careful builders with permanence. Outside the Lyceum's walls, political forces shift once more. The world Aristotle helped shape through thought is about to remind him that ideas, however systematic, remain vulnerable to power. With the Lyceum fully alive, Aristotle turns his attention to a task so vast it borders on audacity. He attempts to catalogue the world itself, not poetically, not symbolically, but systematically, patiently, and with relentless precision. This is not the work of a mystic searching for hidden meaning. It is the labor of a mind convinced that reality, in all its diversity, can be understood if approached correctly. He begins with living things. Animals are no longer curiosities or metaphors. They are data. Aristotle observes them alive, dissects them dead, and compares them across regions. He notes similarities and differences in blood, organs, reproduction, and movement. He distinguishes creatures with lungs from those with gills, animals that bear live young from those that lay eggs, species that live alone from those that organize socially. Nature, he insists, does not move randomly. It follows patterns that reward attention. This biological work reflects his deepest philosophical conviction. Form is not separate from matter. It is expressed through it. A creature's structure reveals its purpose. Teeth are shaped for eating, wings for flight. Organs exist not by accident, but in service of life's ends. By tracing these relationships, Aristotle believes he is not reducing life, but honoring its internal logic. At the same time, he brings the same discipline to thought itself. Logic becomes his most powerful tool. Aristotle does not invent reasoning, but he organizes it. He defines how arguments work, how premises support conclusions, how ambiguity produces error. Syllogisms become instruments for clarity. If all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, then Socrates is mortal, simple, inevitable, and devastating to careless thinking. This work does more than sharpen debate. It changes how knowledge is pursued. Logic becomes a universal framework, applicable to science, ethics, politics, and rhetoric. Thought itself becomes accountable. Claims must be supported. Conclusions must follow. This insistence on structure protects inquiry from persuasion disguised as truth. Ethics receives the same treatment. Aristotle refuses to reduce morality to commandments or ideals. He catalogues virtues as patterns of behavior developed through habit. Courage, generosity, patience, honesty. Each exists as a mean between destructive extremes. Ethics becomes practical rather than aspirational. It describes how good lives are actually lived, not how perfect beings might behave. Politics expands from this ethical foundation. Aristotle and his students gather constitutions from across the Greek world. They compared democracies, oligarchies, monarchies, and mixed systems. He classifies regimes not by slogans, but by outcomes. Which systems endure, which collapse, which foster stability, and which invite revolt. Political theory becomes empirical, grounded in observation rather than ideology. Across all these domains, the same method repeats itself like a steady heartbeat. Observe carefully, define precisely, classify patiently, resist false certainty. Aristotle does not rush toward grand conclusions. He builds frameworks sturdy enough to hold complexity without collapsing into chaos. This cataloging effort is exhausting, and deliberately so. Aristotle believes that understanding requires work. There are no shortcuts to wisdom. Every distinction sharpened, every category clarified, every exception noted adds weight to the structure he is building. His philosophy grows not through inspiration, but through accumulation. What emerges from this period is unprecedented. A unified approach to knowledge that treats nature, thought, character, and governance as intelligible systems governed by causes and purposes. Aristotle is no longer merely interpreting the world. He is organizing it in a way that future generations can inherit, test, and revise. Yet even as his intellectual map expands, Aristotle remains aware of its fragility. Systems depend on stability. Inquiry depends on tolerance. And both exist at the mercy of political winds. As Athens grows restless once more, the man who catalogued the world will soon face a reminder that classification does not grant protection. By the time Aristotle reaches the height of his influence, the nature of his greatness has become unmistakable, though it is often misunderstood. He is not revered because he claims divine insight. He is not followed because he promises revelation. Aristotle's authority rests on something far less theatrical and far more durable: method. He becomes great not because he knows everything, but because he shows how knowledge itself should be pursued. This distinction matters. In an age drawn to prophets, visionaries, and charismatic certainty, Aristotle offers something quieter and more demanding. He offers procedure. Define your terms. Observe the evidence. Distinguish what must be true from what is likely true. Accept uncertainty where certainty does not belong. This commitment to method explains why Aristotle resists mythic explanations even when they are comforting. He does not deny wonder. He refuses to let wonder replace understanding. Where others invoke divine intention to explain complexity, Aristotle asks, what internal principles guide growth and change? Where others seek moral purity, he seeks balance shaped by habit and circumstance. His greatness lies in restraint. This is especially visible in his rejection of intellectual shortcuts. Aristotle does not claim access to hidden realms of truth. He insists that knowledge begins with what is available to human senses and reason. This makes his philosophy accessible, but also unforgiving. Anyone may begin the process. Few have the patience to complete it. He is great not because he simplifies the world, but because he refuses to simplify it falsely. He accepts contradiction without surrendering coherence. Human beings are rational and emotional. Societies are ordered and unstable. Nature is purposeful and unpredictable. Aristotle builds a framework capable of holding these tensions without collapsing into dogma. This emphasis on method reshapes education itself. At the Lyceum, students are not trained to memorize doctrines. They are trained to think. They learn how to analyze arguments, how to identify causes, how to classify phenomena. Knowledge becomes transferable. A student trained in Aristotle's method can apply it to medicine, politics, ethics, or science. This portability becomes one of his most enduring contributions. The contrast with Plato sharpens here, though Aristotle never disowns his teacher. Plato sought truth beyond appearances. Aristotle insists truth reveals itself within them. Plato trusted vision. Aristotle trusts process. He is great not because he rejects ideals, but because he refuses to let ideals outrun evidence. This approach also explains why Aristotle's work survives translation, reinterpretation, and misuse. His conclusions are debated. His methods endure, even when his scientific claims are later revised or overturned. The structure of inquiry he built remains intact. He teaches future generations not what to think, but how to think responsibly. Yet this very strength creates vulnerability. Method does not inspire loyalty the way myth does. It does not rally crowds. It does not flatter power. It demands time, patience, and humility, qualities rarely rewarded by politics. Aristotle understands this. He does not expect gratitude. He expects resistance. His greatness, then, is of a particular kind. It is constructive rather than charismatic. It builds slowly. It shapes institutions rather than moments. It influences centuries rather than crowds. Aristotle does not burn brightly and disappear. He endures. As his influence spreads, so does unease. Athens watches a foreign-born philosopher systematize knowledge, attract students, and command intellectual authority. The city tolerates him, but it does not trust him. And as history has already taught Aristotle once before, tolerance can vanish quickly when fear returns. As pressure builds around him, Aristotle's response is not defiance nor retreat into mysticism. It is clarification. In the face of accusation and fear, he does not claim divine protection or prophetic authority. He does not wrap himself in myth. Instead, he returns once more to method. This is where his true power has always resided. Aristotle understands something his critics often miss. Myth inspires loyalty, but it also demands submission. Revelation ends inquiry by declaring truth complete. Process does the opposite. It invites correction. It exposes error. It accepts revision. Aristotle's greatness lies precisely here, in his refusal to pretend that knowledge arrives whole and perfect from beyond the world. He has never claimed special access to the divine. He does not speak as a mouthpiece of the gods. When he discusses the unmoved mover, it is not a personal deity issuing commands, but a philosophical necessity, a principle of motion and order inferred through reasoning. Even the highest concepts in his system are reached through analysis, not revelation. Nothing is exempt from examination. This insistence on process reshapes every domain he touches. In science, causes are traced step by step. In ethics, virtue is formed gradually through habit. In politics, stability emerges through balance, not charisma. Aristotle rejects the idea that greatness descends suddenly upon individuals. It is constructed through discipline, repetition, and restraint. This view places him at odds with both religious traditionalists and political idealists. Those who seek certainty find his method unsatisfying. Those who seek authority find it threatening. A process cannot be worshipped. It cannot be easily controlled. It does not declare final answers. It demands participation. Aristotle is great not because he claims to see farther than others, but because he teaches others how to see more clearly. His power is distributive rather than concentrated. Anyone willing to observe, classify, and reason may enter the work. This democratization of thought is subtle but profound. It undermines the idea that wisdom belongs to a chosen few. Yet, Aristotle is not naive about this power. He knows that process lacks spectacle. It does not stir crowds or sanctify rulers. It does not protect its practitioners from accusation. In a city anxious about loyalty and control, a method that empowers independent judgment feels dangerous. Still, he holds to it. He refuses to retreat into symbolic gestures or philosophical theater. He will not turn his work into myth to make it safer. He understands that doing so would betray its purpose. Knowledge gained without effort becomes belief. Belief without examination becomes dogma. This commitment explains both his endurance and his vulnerability. Systems built on myth rise quickly and fall violently. Systems built on method grow slowly and persist quietly. Aristotle chooses the slower path, fully aware of its cost. As accusations intensify and alliances shift, Aristotle's clarity becomes almost serene. He knows what he has built. He knows what he has refused to build. And he knows that if he must choose between symbolic sacrifice and living inquiry, his philosophy has already answered for him. The greatness of Aristotle does not blaze. It accumulates. It does not demand reverence. It demands work. And in a world hungry for certainty, that demand itself becomes a form of quiet resistance. When Alexander dies, the news travels faster than clarity. Empires do not end cleanly. They fracture. Power vacuums invite fear, vengeance, and the settling of old scores. In Athens, the reaction is immediate and volatile. Macedonian authority weakens, and with it collapses the thin tolerance extended to those associated with it. Aristotle understands the danger before it is spoken aloud. The accusations resurface with renewed force. Impiety, disloyalty, corrupting influence. These are not precise charges. They are instruments. Athens is searching for symbols through which to reassert its wounded autonomy. And Aristotle stands exposed, a foreign-born philosopher, connected to Macedonian power, commanding intellectual authority. The pattern is unmistakable. This moment brings history painfully close. Aristotle remembers Socrates not as a martyr carved in memory, but as a man silenced by civic anxiety. He understands that trials in such times are not about truth. They are about purification. The city seeks to cleanse itself of humiliation by sacrificing a representative figure. Faced with this reality, Aristotle makes a decision that will define him as clearly as any theory. He refuses to become a symbol. He chooses exile over execution, flight over theatrical death. He is reported to have said that he will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. Whether the words are exact matters less than the resolve they capture. This choice is not cowardice, it is consistency. Aristotle has spent his life arguing that virtue lies in proportion, not extremity. Martyrdom satisfies myth, not method. A dead philosopher teaches nothing new. A living one preserves the possibility of correction, continuation, and quiet influence. Leaving Athens again, Aristotle accepts the cost of survival. He abandons the Lyceum, the institution he built with such care. He leaves students, manuscripts, and unfinished projects behind. The departure is heavy with loss, yet free of bitterness. He has learned that institutions are temporary, but inquiry must adapt to endure. Exile forces Aristotle into humility once more. All systems, no matter how well constructed, exist within political limits. Knowledge depends not only on rigor, but on circumstance. This recognition does not weaken his philosophy, it completes it. Understanding must account for power as well as truth. As he travels toward Chalcis, away from the city that both nurtured and threatened him, Aristotle carries with him the full weight of his life's work. He does not know how much time remains. He does not know whether his writings will survive intact, but he knows what he has chosen to protect: the continuity of thinking itself. This moment marks the final turning of the emotional rhythm. Victory gives way to vulnerability. Mastery gives way to mortality. Yet there is calm in this retreat. Aristotle has faced the ultimate test of his philosophy and acted in accordance with it. Survival, in this case, is not compromise. It is fidelity to a way of thinking that values endurance over spectacle. In Chalcis, far from the intellectual heat of Athens, Aristotle's world grows smaller and quieter. The urgency that once drove lectures, classifications, and debates gives way to the slow, undeniable rhythms of the body. Illness settles in, not dramatically, but persistently, a reminder that even the most disciplined mind remains housed in fragile flesh. For a man who spent his life studying causes, this final period offers no illusion of exemption. Aristotle does not treat his decline as tragedy. He has seen enough of life to know that decay is not failure, but completion. Bodies weaken, systems dissolve. Even the most carefully balanced structures yield to time. What matters, he believes, is not permanence of form, but continuity of function. Knowledge must outlive the knower. Confined more often now, Aristotle reflects without indulgence. He does not revise his life into a narrative of triumph or victimhood. He reviews it as he would any complex system, noting pressures, adaptations, and consequences. Exile appears not as injustice alone, but as a recurring condition of independence. Loss appears not as accident, but as a constant companion to inquiry. His thoughts turn, inevitably, to education and inheritance. His son, Nicomachus, stands as both legacy and responsibility. Aristotle understands that teaching is never complete. It is always interrupted by death. What endures is not instruction, but example. A way of approaching the world patiently, critically, without surrender to certainty or despair. Illness sharpens his perspective rather than narrowing it. He sees more clearly the relationship between ethics and mortality. Virtue is not preparation for immortality. It is a response to finitude. Courage matters because fear is real. Moderation matters because excess tempts fragile bodies. Wisdom matters because time is limited. There is no bitterness in these reflections. Aristotle does not rage against Athens, nor against fate. He accepts that cities act from fear, that power resists scrutiny, and that philosophy must often withdraw to survive. This acceptance is not resignation, it is alignment. His life, like his ethics, has followed the mean, resisting extremes, even at the end. The world beyond Chalcis continues to shift. Empires fracture, cities realign. None of this requires Aristotle's comment now. He has already offered his framework. History will test it long after he is gone. His concern in these final months is quieter and more precise. Has he shown how to think without illusion? Has he demonstrated how to live without myth? As his strength fades, Aristotle's voice softens, but his clarity remains. He does not cling to unfinished systems. He trusts that incompletion is part of truth. No catalogue can be final. No method can exhaust reality. The task was never to finish understanding, but to begin it properly. Death approaches not as an enemy, but as a boundary he has long acknowledged. Aristotle meets it without ceremony, leaving behind no dramatic final speech, no demand for remembrance. What remains instead are texts, students, and a way of reasoning that does not depend on his presence to function. In his final illness and quiet decline, Aristotle embodies his philosophy completely. Life is purposeful, finite, and intelligible enough to guide action, but never so complete that it ends inquiry. Even here, even now, the work continues beyond him. In Chalcis, far from the intellectual heat of Athens, Aristotle's world grows smaller and quieter. The urgency that once drove lectures, classifications, and debates gives way to the slow, undeniable rhythms of the body. Illness settles in, not dramatically, but persistently, a reminder that even the most disciplined mind remains housed in fragile flesh. For a man who spent his life studying causes, this final period offers no illusion of exemption. Aristotle does not treat his decline as tragedy. He has seen enough of life to know that decay is not failure, but completion. Bodies weaken, systems dissolve. Even the most carefully balanced structures yield to time. What matters, he believes, is not permanence of form, but continuity of function. Knowledge must outlive the knower. Confined more often now, Aristotle reflects without indulgence. He does not revise his life into a narrative of triumph or victimhood. He reviews it as he would any complex system, noting pressures, adaptations, and consequences. Exile appears not as injustice alone, but as a recurring condition of independence. Loss appears not as accident, but as a constant companion to inquiry. His thoughts turn, inevitably, to education and inheritance. His son, Nicomachus, stands as both legacy and responsibility. Aristotle understands that teaching is never complete. It is always interrupted by death. What endures is not instruction, but example, a way of approaching the world patiently, critically, without surrender to certainty or despair. Illness sharpens his perspective rather than narrowing it. He sees more clearly the relationship between ethics and mortality. Virtue is not preparation for immortality. It is a response to finitude. Courage matters because fear is real. Moderation matters because excess tempts fragile bodies. Wisdom matters because time is limited. There is no bitterness in these reflections. Aristotle does not rage against Athens, nor against fate. He accepts that cities act from fear, that power resists scrutiny, and that philosophy must often withdraw to survive. This acceptance is not resignation, it is alignment. His life, like his ethics, has followed the mean, resisting extremes even at the end. The world beyond Chalcis continues to shift. Empires fracture, cities realign. None of this requires Aristotle's comment now. He has already offered his framework. History will test it long after he is gone. His concern in these final months is quieter and more precise. Has he shown how to think without illusion? Has he demonstrated how to live without myth? As his strength fades, Aristotle's voice softens, but his clarity remains. He does not cling to unfinished systems. He trusts that incompletion is part of truth. No catalogue can be final. No method can exhaust reality. The task was never to finish understanding, but to begin it properly. Death approaches not as an enemy, but as a boundary he has long acknowledged. Aristotle meets it without ceremony, leaving behind no dramatic final speech, no demand for remembrance. What remains instead are texts, students, and a way of reasoning that does not depend on his presence to function. In his final illness and quiet decline, Aristotle embodies his philosophy completely. Life is purposeful, finite, and intelligible enough to guide action, but never so complete that it ends inquiry. Even here, even now, the work continues beyond him. When the centuries begin to move beyond Aristotle's lifetime, his presence does not fade in the way most lives do. It diffuses, quietly, steadily. His mind begins structuring civilization itself, not through monuments or decrees, but through habits of thought that seep into education, science, ethics, and reasoning across. What survives first is not his biography, but his method. Students inherit ways of thinking before they inherit conclusions. Logic becomes the skeleton of argument. Syllogisms discipline debate. Definitions anchor inquiry. The simple insistence that claims must be supported by reasons reshapes how truth is pursued. Even those who never read Aristotle directly begin thinking in patterns he designed. Science, as it slowly emerges from philosophy, carries his fingerprints everywhere. Observation precedes explanation. Causes are traced rather than assumed. Nature is treated as intelligible, not enchanted. Though later discoveries will overturn many of his biological claims, the approach he modeled remains intact. Look closely, compare patiently, revise when evidence demands it. In this way, Aristotle fathers inquiry without demanding obedience. Ethics, too, absorbs his influence deeply. The idea that character is formed through habit becomes foundational. Moral life is no longer imagined as a single moment of revelation or conversion, but as a long process shaped by repetition, community, and choice. Virtue ethics survives not because it promises purity, but because it reflects lived experience. People recognize themselves in it. Imperfect, striving, capable of balance, but vulnerable to excess. Politics inherits Aristotle's realism. Governments are studied as systems, not myths. Stability is analyzed rather than assumed. Power is examined in relation to character and circumstance. Even modern political thought, when it debates institutions, constitutions, and civic virtue, echoes Aristotle's refusal to treat ideology as sufficient explanation. Across civilizations, his ideas migrate and adapt. Islamic scholars preserve, translate, and expand his works, integrating them into theology, medicine, and science. Medieval universities organize curricula around his logic and ethics. Renaissance thinkers argue with him, refine him, resist him, and in doing so, extend his reach. Each generation reshapes Aristotle, but none fully escapes him. This endurance reveals something essential about his achievement. Aristotle does not dominate intellectual history by being unquestioned. He dominates it by being unavoidable. To think rigorously is to engage, directly or indirectly, with the structures he built. Even revolutions against him borrow his tools. His influence is not always benign. His authority has been used to justify hierarchy, exclusion, and rigidity. Aristotle himself would likely recognize this danger. Method does not guarantee virtue. Clarity does not prevent misuse. He never believed knowledge alone could save humanity, only guide it. Yet even in misuse, his framework remains visible. Whenever thinkers distinguish kinds of truth, whenever they resist false certainty, whenever they demand causes instead of slogans, Aristotle's mind is at work. This is how he structures civilization, not as a ruler of thought, but as its architect. His ideas become the scaffolding upon which others build, dismantle, and rebuild. Empires vanish, languages change, institutions collapse. But the habits of reasoning he shaped continue to organize how human beings understand the world and themselves. Aristotle's greatest achievement, then, is not that he answered questions forever, but that he taught civilization how to keep asking them responsibly. As the noise of history recedes, Aristotle's life settles into something quieter than triumph and deeper than survival. Empires that once defined his danger and his hope dissolve into fragments. Cities that judged him rise and fall, their names repurposed as lessons rather than powers. Faiths emerge, transform, and fracture, each offering visions of ultimate truth. And through all of this movement, Aristotle's questions remain. They remain because they were never anchored to any single authority. Aristotle did not build his legacy by offering final answers. He built it by asking better questions than most civilizations knew how to ask. What is a thing made of? What causes it to change? What purpose does it serve? What kind of life allows human beings to flourish not momentarily, but over time? These questions survive belief systems precisely because they do not compete with them. They operate beneath them. His thought settles into the background of human reasoning, becoming part of how people think rather than what they think. When scientists ask how causes operate in nature, they echo Aristotle. When ethicists speak of character shaped by habit, they echo Aristotle. When lawmakers debate balance, stability, and the dangers of extremes, they echo Aristotle. Often unknowingly, often indirectly, but unmistakably. This is what it means to outlive empires. Power demands loyalty in the present. Thought earns relevance across centuries. Aristotle never commanded armies. He never ruled cities. Yet his method travels farther than Alexander ever did, crossing borders without violence, adapting to cultures without conquest. It also outlives faiths, not by replacing them, but by coexisting with them. Aristotle's work is absorbed into religious traditions that differ radically from one another, because his method does not dictate belief. It disciplines reasoning. It teaches thinkers how to speak carefully about things that matter deeply, without collapsing into certainty or surrendering to chaos. This endurance would have pleased him, though he would not have celebrated it loudly. Aristotle never trusted excess, even in legacy. He understood that immortality, if it exists at all, is incremental. It arrives not through monuments, but through use. An idea lives as long as someone finds it helpful. His own life prepared him for this quiet ending. Orphaned early, he learned that continuity does not depend on permanence. Exiled twice, he learned that survival often requires withdrawal rather than confrontation. A teacher to kings, he learned that power magnifies character but does not create it. A builder of institutions, he learned that systems must outlast individuals to matter. In the end, Aristotle becomes exactly what his philosophy predicted: a finite being whose work exceeds his lifespan, a system of inquiry that continues without him, a presence felt more strongly in absence than in authority. There is no dramatic final image to hold on to, no execution, no coronation, no revelation, just a body returning to the earth, and a way of thinking continuing onward, passed quietly from teacher to student, from text to mind, from question to question. The emotional rhythm resolves here, not with spectacle, but with settling. The urgency softens, the language grows gentler, the questions slow down, not because they are answered, but because they are now held securely within human culture. Aristotle does not need to speak anymore. His method speaks for him, and so the story closes not with certainty, but with continuity. A man once accused of impiety becomes indispensable to theology. A foreigner once distrusted by Athens becomes foundational to Western education. A philosopher who rejected myth becomes quietly immortal, not because he promised meaning, but because he taught humanity how to look for it carefully.